Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it's now time to delve into another movie. And this is one that I saw recently for the first time. Even though this is a movie I've had in my collection for several years. Been meaning to watch it, and I do like some of the director's other films, even though I'm going to admit I have not seen every one of his non-comic book related films. But this is a film that me and my friend had the pleasure of seeing in theaters during its recent flashback cinema re-release at a local theater. And I'm going to say I'm happy that the first time I saw it, just for the visual effects alone, was on the big screen. Because while they say a good film you can watch anywhere, just some of the visual oomph probably would have been lost in translation watching it for the first time on my normal setup versus watching it on a big screen, especially the DFX setup that it was playing in. And this, of course, is Christopher Nolan's 2014 film starring Matthew McConaughey, Anne Hathaway, and Michael Caine. This, of course, is Interstellar. Now, like I mentioned just a second ago, most of Nolan's films I have not watched. I've seen all his Batman films, but of his non-Batman films, the only ones I've seen before this were his recent one, Oppenheimer, and Memento, which I only saw that last year, and in order to get in the right headspace for her to review, I'd probably have to watch again. But having watched this, I'm actually looking forward to watching some of his other ones, like, even though there's all the memes, I haven't seen Inception, and I have not seen The Prestige, so I'm looking forward to seeing those more, even though I've heard some weird views about how people like The Prestige and all that, but we'll see what my thoughts are on that or when I actually get around to watching it. Now, this film was written by Christopher and his brother Jonathan Nolan, and it started several years before this when Steven Spielberg, who was attached to direct at the time, hired Jonathan to write the screenplay. But as things go sometimes, as the development process went along, Spielberg decided to go to other projects instead. And it was in 2012, after he departed, that Jonathan suggested his brother take on the project, and the rest, as they say, is history. He attached. And I'm trying to imagine how this film would have been with Spielberg's directing style, given the plot, if a lot of it hadn't changed. Probably would have been a lot more dealing with the family from a different view because of Spielberg using broken families as one of his plot devices. They probably would have focused a little bit more on that. The visual style would have been a little bit more whimsical, because that's Spielberg's MO usually when it comes to films with a good amount of spectacle. You know, I mean, the Indiana Jones films, especially the second one's a little bit of an exception, but there is still some whimsy to some of that spectacle, but he does kind of temper it with a little bit of darkness when he has to. Especially the second one. It's called The Temple of Doom for a reason. Now, the film was made for $165 million. Nowadays, it's probably over $200 million, just to account for 10 years of inflation. And it made its money back worldwide, $731 million. So even going off a Hollywood accounting of double to break budget, that's more than break budget. Because let's see, if you round it to 200, that'd be 400 to break even. So like 3 something. So yeah, it definitely made some money back there. Of course, you got to temper that. According to IMDb, 188 of it is U.S. money, but that could be just during initial release, and that 731 could be in the 10 years since then. I just find the whole process of Hollywood accounting interesting. That's why I always have to bring it up whenever I bring up how much these things cost to make. Now, like some of Nolan's other projects, Hans Zimmer is the one who did the score, and I have to go back and re-listen to it just independently, but I think this might be my favorite of the scores he's done in a Nolan film, and definitely in the running for my favorite scores he's done in general, because there's just something about it that just, it definitely fits the whole story and tone of the film, but there's just something about it that gets very emotional. It's hard to describe without listening to it independently, but if these little notes that talk about it or anything, you can kind of get what I mean. This is what Nolan told Zimmer when they were in the process of developing the score. It's time to reinvent. The endless string need to go by the wayside. The big drums are probably in the bin. And Nolan provided Zimmer with one page of text that had nothing to do with the script or any plot details for the story. Which, of course, as we know, a lot of composers usually write their best music for film when they have an idea of the story of the film. And that seems to be one of the reasons why John Williams' scores for the sequel trilogy are not as good when you compare it to the prequel and the OT, because he probably didn't know as much because he's not working one-on-one with Lucas in that regard. Not to say his music is bad, I mean, he's still got some good score in there. But here, Zimmer's got that one page of it, and it's the story that he's supposed to convey. Nothing to do with it. Which probably means that a lot of that text is like, okay, for this portion of the story, this is the story we want your music to convey. This is, well, from A to B to Z. And you get that feeling there, not to say that it's disconnected from what's being shown on screen, but the emotional resonance definitely feels different than if it was written to go note to note with it. Like, you don't feel like there's moments where they're just changing up the music to match what's going on screen, you know, like da-na-na-na, something happens, da-na-na, not like that. The music is just going with the visuals, and it's really matching the emotional intensity. Like if it's an actiony moment, it feels like it matches. If it's an emotional moment, like that scene where McConaughey's character is getting all the messages, definitely fits. And this is what Nolan had to say later about Zimmer's score, that he thought this was his strongest and most powerful one. Based on how I've been gushing about the score, you can see I agree with it. Now, in addition to the actors I mentioned at the top, we got Jessica Chastain playing Matthew McConaughey's daughter as an adult. Of course, she also played the adult Bev Marsh in the second part of the It film, so there's that. We got Mackenzie Foy playing her younger version. We got John Lithgow playing Donald, who is Matthew McConaughey's father-in-law. And a little funny little bit of trivia is that when you look at what time period the movie's supposed to take place in, Lithgow's character is a millennial. It's interesting seeing like him playing an adult that's supposed to be a millennial based on the time jump forward. It's interesting. And of course we got Timothée Chalamet playing McConaughey's son Tom as a teenager, which Timothy definitely has jumped in popularity since he did this film with all the other projects he's done. Of course, I got Casey Affleck playing adult Tom. I didn't realize that's who it was at first when I was watching. I'm like, he looks familiar. And then afterwards, I'm like, oh, it's Casey Affleck. No wonder. And of course, Michael Caine and Hathaway I mentioned already. Then we got, I'm probably going to butcher this last name, David Gassai. He plays a Romilly, who is another member of the crew. He, of course, was in films like Cloud Atlas and The Dark Knight Rises. We got Bill Irwin voicing Tars, which was this film's version of an AI robot thingy. Of course, he played Lulu Who in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and he was also in Lady in the Water. And then, of course, you got Matt Damon in there in a surprise role as a character Man. It's like a surprise Matt Damon cameo. Now, the film takes place on Earth in the not too distant but not too close future. I forget what year exactly, and I didn't put it in there, but it's far enough in the future where technology is a little bit more advanced, but not too far advanced where we could be like, oh yeah, like that's ever going to happen. Now, a disease called the blight is affecting a lot of the Earth's crops. Stuff is dying out. At the time we start the film, corn is the main one that people are trying to grow, but it looks like within the next decade or two, it'll start affecting that as well. Now, because of this, we're getting a Dust Bowl scenario going on, which what makes this part of the film feel especially real is that Nolan does draw on a lot of the primary sources we still have for how the Dust Bowl portion of the Great Depression went, from the interviews like in Ken Burns' documentary, which they did use some archival footage for, and actually using like actual dust in the scenes to make it feel more realistic, because you actually have something on there in the set. That's one thing I love about Nolan's touch, is that if he can do a practical in a safe way, he'll do a practical in a safe way. And of course they make it feel semi-documentary feel at that point when we're seeing like some interviews that are supposed to be people who grew up in this part of the world and then talking years later about how it felt. It definitely adds a little bit more realism to it. Now, our main character is a man named Cooper, who's Matthew McConaughey's character. He's a former pilot for NASA, that in the years since, he's had to come down to Earth, as it were, and essentially become a farmer. Now, a lot of people are farmers. A lot of the more advanced stuff that we take for granted now, NASA and other programs like that, have basically collapsed, because at this point with humanity it's more about sustaining the entire species and by extension parts of the planet than it is exploring. And with that, now some of the darker aspects of humanity today, I know some people are going to say why I say darker, but it's from my viewpoint here, that we take for granted today, like, oh yeah, that's just crazy, do pop up a little bit. And what I'm talking about is like people that say the moon landing was fake and stuff like that, because they bring up that in the form of Cooper's daughter taking a book to school that mentions stuff like that, and the teacher basically is denying it. It's akin to like nowadays the flat earthers trying to say like, oh, the whole curve of all that, and the few people who still try to deny the moon landing and say it was just all propaganda for just some stupid reason. Or of course my favorite, the people who try to reject the heliocentric viewpoint and go back to the geocentric one. You know, the one where Earth is center of the universe. It was like, oh yeah, next you're going to tell me the firmament is real. See how many people know what that deep cut is. Now with that, the way McConaughey played the character in that scene, I'm like, oh yeah, that'd probably be me if I was hearing that from my daughter's teacher. But I'd have to be like, so did you, I'd probably say something like, so did you attend school or did you buy your degree online? Because an educator saying that is very stupid, but I shouldn't be surprised. There have been educators that say pretty stupid stuff. Now, in the first scenes, we're seeing just how a man and his family are dealing with this. We see Cooper interacting with his kids, with his father-in-law, trying to survive as a farmer, dealing with the blight. We get a little bit of insight into what type of character Cooper was before it, the whole relationship with his late wife. And we start to feel for him. Well, then one night, him and his daughter, and this is after they find a drone from the old days, they make their way out and they stumble across this one bit of private property. They get attacked by Tars, the robot, and also the Anne Hathaway's character, Brand. And they're brought in and they find the remains of NASA, and they talk to Professor Brand, Michael Caine's character, and he explains that the reason NASA is still there is because the blight's going to get worse, and they're feeling that the main way to make sure the human race sustains themselves after all this is that we have to leave the planet. Which, of course, we talk about nowadays as a option if we don't take care of this planet the way we should. Or at least if we do, like, start colonizing other planets, expand the human race, as it were, essentially take the better aspects of the age of exploration and apply it to space. I say better aspects because, of course, there's a lot of negative about that, too. And they ask Matthew McConaughey, due to the fact that he had that previous pilot experience, to be the pilot for this first mission, which is a spaceship with a group of scientists, just a handful of them. They're going to go up. They're going to follow some reconnaissance pilots that they've already sent up to find a new habitable planet. Now, how they're doing this is that they discovered there's a wormhole in the orbit of Saturn, which is a nice little reference to the fact that that is where they went in the book version of 2001: A Space Odyssey. They're going to go through the wormhole and look at a few planets that they found through there with probes that are orbiting a black hole, to see which ones seem like the best prospects for future colonization. Now, because they're going to be traveling, one in space at sublight speeds and also in the vicinity of a black hole, time dilation and relativity are going to apply. Which means that while to them time is going to be moving at a slower pace, for everyone back on Earth it's going to be moving faster. So if they do come back, by the time they do so, this is mainly a thing for Cooper, his kids could already be at the same age, if not older. It's a riskiest to take, but it's part of the drama with the family. Like when he does end up leaving, his daughter is refusing to talk with him, so he has to deal with that little chestnut. And it's a very sad and dramatic moment. It's like, yeah, your own daughter not wanting to talk with you, when it's like, this is for the good of not only you but all of humanity. We have to do this. And of course they take off into space, and the special effects for this space part of the movie, excellent. They end up getting to the wormhole, going through the wormhole, end up in the vicinity of the black hole, and they explore all the different planets. And unlike other sci-fi films, all the planets are not like note-for-note copies of stuff on Earth. I mean, it's kind of terrains we would expect to see on other planets. And it does kind of follow like some of it, where it's like the desert planet and all that. But instead of it, we get the ocean planet, or should I say a water planet, where it seems like you can just walk through it, but then there's massive waves that would kind of kill most life on there. And if you did set up a colony, it'd have to be a one that's either in space or one that constantly is on the move to avoid the waves. So it's not very practical. It's more a resource planet. But then you have the little caveat that because of how close to the black hole that one is, the time dilation is funny. And I like how they kind of show that with the score, where like each time you hear like a little click or whatnot, it's 1 day passing on Earth. So you got to really be careful with how long you're on there. And we got the planet where there's nothing but ice and rock, along with like the clouds that are frozen, which apparently is one of the biggest suspensions of disbelief that Dr. Kip Thorne, who was involved with the production of the film, said they did, which I got some notes about him I'll talk about in a moment. And of course it does deal a little bit with doing all the space exploration. Like if you went off by yourself, you'd have to deal with the loneliness, the isolation, and how mentally grating that would be. That's where Matt Damon's character comes in, which, watching this film in theaters, I remember some of the spoilers from people talking about it over the years, that there was something about his character that was off, and watching it in the beginning, I kind of got that. Then when the twist comes, it's like, oh yeah, he's really getting cabin fever and the loneliness, that he just has to see another human face, the mission and all that stuff be damned, when he could have just stayed in there and then they could have went and got him afterwards. But also part of that is the bickering that everyone on the mission had to do in order to figure out which plan to go to next, which one seems like the best prospect at the least amount of time. But one of those things, if they went to that other planet second, they would have saved all that time, not have to deal with the drama of the man character, and they would have gotten a better prospect. Might not have been the best prospect, because the film does kind of end a little on a cliffhanger with that, where if they had wanted to, they could have done a sequel. But I think that ending it better with like, okay, there is that little prospect of humanity continuing in the future because of the work these scientists did in the film. Just leaving it with that little bit of hope. It's a nice little caveat there for humanity, because hope can be a powerful thing. Sometimes it's all we have to drive ourselves forward. I mean, there's a lot of human stories and through cinema that do that. I mean, like, hope is the main driving force of our main character in Shawshank Redemption, the hope of being free. Here's the hope of survival and the future of the human race. And a certain line from God of War 3 kind of sums up the whole thing with hope best. Hope is what makes us strong. It is why we are here. It's what we fight for when all else seems lost. And of course with this, that really does fit. I mean, everything seems lost, but the hope of a brighter future, even if it's away from our birthplace on Earth, is what drives a lot of the plot forward. And of course the ending thing, it does end on that strong note. Now, I do have a good amount of notes here. Some of them are going to be tied in. I already talked about the first one on here. Another thing to mention here, to tie in with the whole Saturn thing. Another little fun fact about that is that Saturn apparently was the Roman god of agriculture. So the whole thing with the blight and all that's a nice little wink and a nod there. I don't know if Nolan and them did that intentionally, but that was incidental. It is a fun coincidence to do that. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Nolan likes doing things practical when he can, and that included the cornfield. That was all real corn, not on a set, not CGI. That was 500 acres of actual corn. Now, he learned that was feasible to do after producing Man of Steel, because there's some corn in that one. And of course, it looked good on screen. And after the film wrapped, they were able to sell the corn and actually made a profit. I just wonder how much money they made on that, but profit's a profit. So I wonder around that time how many of us watching this or doing any of this actually ate some of the corn that was actually on screen in that movie. I could have had some corn tortillas or some cornbread made from that corn. Now, here's some of the Kip Thorne ones. To create the wormhole and the black hole, Dr. Thorne, he collaborated with the visual effects supervisor Paul J. Franklin and his team at Double Negative, and he provided pages and pages of deeply sourced theoretical equations, because at the time the whole look of a black hole was still theoretical. It's only after the film was made that we actually got our first decent photo of a black hole. And be fair, from what I understand, even though the photo's not the best quality because it's deep space, it is pretty similar to what Thorne and the team managed to create for the film. And of course, to make it, they had to create a new CGI software program they based on these equations to generate things accurately, the simulations. And to go with it, some frames took up to 100 hours to render. And it took 800 terabytes of data. Think about that, terabytes. That's the one up from a gigabyte. That's a lot of data that you have to use to compute right there. But I have to say, with how that part looks on film, especially in the DFX way I saw it, it was worth it. The visual effects, I gotta really praise for this. And of course, while they were early in production, Thorne laid down 2 guidelines. Nothing would violate established physical laws, and all the wild speculations would have to spring from science and not from the screenwriter's imagination, which is why this stuff is a little bit more grounded than, say, stuff like Star Wars and some aspects of Star Trek. And of course, Nolan accepted these terms, but he was like, as long as they don't get in the way of making the movie, which I like when directors have that philosophy. That's the same type of philosophy that John Carpenter had when it came to his actors ad-libbing parts of their character or bits of dialogue, as long as it just didn't interfere with his film. Now, of course, there were still clashes, like at one point Thorne had to spend 2 weeks talking Nolan out of an idea of traveling faster than light, which, based on current understanding of the laws of physics and relativity and all that, I can get, is that press time, it is impossible to travel faster than light. I mean, we have the other ways of circumventing traveling across space. I mean, that's the whole purpose of a wormhole. And then, of course, other stuff like folding space, but as far as we know, it is impossible at this point to travel faster than light. Of course, Star Wars and Star Trek, they show stuff like that all the time. Like I mentioned earlier, the most extreme example of suspension of disbelief that they did was, of course, the clouds on the ice planet, because if you want to think about it, while it's a fun little visual, from a structural standpoint, they would probably not last. And of course, the space travel shown in this film is based on Dr. Thorne's works, and it's also the basis for the space travel we see in another film that McConaughey was in that was based on a novel by Carl Sagan. That, of course, is Contact. That's a film I want to revisit one of these days. I remember liking it. I remember the marketing campaign for it, too. I mean, 97. All the hype there. I know one of these days I'm probably going to do a video talking about the marketing campaigns I remember from childhood. The hypersleep chambers in this film were interesting. I mean, the astronauts' bodies are in a cold liquid, and after they wake up, they really got to be put in the blankets, and especially the thermal ones, to get their body heat back up. And there's actually a little bit more behind the science of this. It's reference to studies that have shown that a state of hibernation can be achieved in the human body by causing hypothermia. It's been used to treat brain damage, and it has been proposed as a viable means of keeping people with severe injuries alive after accidents while they are transported to facilities. Which I could see why. I mean, we've shown that people can survive hypothermia, so it's probably that process. And if you think about it, at least with how technology is going to probably progress in the next couple decades, that's probably how they would do something like that. I mean, we see that there's ways of hibernation in other sci-fi franchises, but it's usually always just them in a cold storage thing that's basically a glorified sleeping area. And of course, it's not the first time that we've had them in the cold liquid. I mean, the novelization for Alien had their hibernation things be cold liquid with them being nude in it. That would have been a little bit more interesting, but the whole cold liquid thing, cool. Last little bit of trivia to talk about is involving what McConaughey finds at the center of the black hole when he goes in. A little spoiler there. And they call it a tesseract, which is a multi-dimensional geometric structure, also called a hypercube. It was coined back in 1888 in a book called A New Era of Thought by Charles Howard Hinton. And it's a structure that extends a normal cube into 4 dimensions, which we're talking about time here and all that, so it makes sense that they would have something called a tesseract there. And of course it was popularized in other films with sci-fi leanings, like a Robert Heinlein short story, and he built a crooked house from 1941. And of course it was also mentioned in the 1962 science fiction novel A Wrinkle in Time. So it has this whole thing. And of course more recently the word Tesseract been absconded by the MCU as the name for the device that the Space Stone was in, which makes sense considering it's a cube and it involves something that can move you through space and time. Of course here it allows the character of Cooper to see all throughout his daughter's life from different moments, and it takes out what seems to be a possible supernatural element and gives it a slightly scientific basis in the fact that it was Cooper. Now of course that means that parts of the film turn into a predestination paradox, which is like, yeah, some people are going to be like that, but it's like, with how it's shown in the film, for me it works, especially since we're talking about the heart of a black hole, something we don't fully understand, so it's one of those things that I can really suspend my disbelief with. Plus there's also the thing, I think a lot of people just overthink time travel in general when it comes to certain things. And then the whole Austin Powers thing, oh no, I've just gone cross-eyed. When I think just thinking of the simpler fact of it for a story purpose works better. Like with Back to the Future. Like, well, how was he able to get it back to? Because the time change had not caught up by that time. Or the time stream is not going to change until everything is back in its original place. You know, the whole thing. Well, there's other weird little things there, but I know some people are going to say you're underthinking it, but you know, I think in this case it's better to underthink than overthink, because overthink you start getting way too convoluted with trying to figure out stuff. Here, just simple predestination paradox because of how the black hole center works. And I don't know if it's sprung from the science and all that, or it's one of the things that they came up with as a compromise, but for how this film was presented, it works. And more than likely, if we're going to be realistic, due to the gravity, if somebody were to fall into a black hole, they'd probably be killed. But you know, that would be a very dark ending for the film. Humanity dies because their hero died at the center of a black hole. As you can see with how I've been gushing about the film, this is a film I do recommend if you haven't seen it. If you're not the biggest fan of Nolan's films, like you think he's kind of a pretentious director, that might not be your cup of tea. Unless you're like a big fan of sci-fi films, I say give it a watch. I don't know if I like him more than Oppenheimer, and I might probably have to watch them back to back, see which one I like better, but I can definitely say I'm starting to become more a fan of Nolan's style. And of course it just goes with my whole thing about his style when it comes to directing superhero films. While he does do a decent job with it, it's not the best style for Batman. And not to say his first two ones aren't bad, but it's like, yeah, it does kind of clash a bit with it, but for like the crime style part of it, it fits, but he probably should have just stayed with other ones. But hey, it's one of those ones that got him more clout in order to direct the type of films he wanted to direct, so it's one of those things, is like, you take the good with the bad. And that's really all I have to say about this film. So until next time, everybody, you'll have a good night out there.